You know, I know most of you know who I am. For the benefit of those who might not know, my name is James Eldridge, or JC. Call me either one, just don't call me late for supper. Most of all of you are familiar with my situation, but for those who might not be, I'll give you some backstory. On February the 5th of this year, I had a heart attack. Then on February the 15th, I was diagnosed with esophageal cancer. Now, before I can get into those details, I need to go back about 7 to 8 months. It was sometime in June or July that I started to get very sick. I was working at the Pro Stop in Roaring Gap for Wayne Miles. I worked in the deli making sandwiches and pizzas, as well as stocking the store, stocking the coolers, cleaning the bathrooms, and so on. It started with dizzy spells, and I started getting sick to my stomach real easily. I noticed that the stomach issues were triggered by certain foods at times, and I talked to several people who seemed to think that it could be my gallbladder. I was told by my doctor that they could do an ultrasound, but they weren't always conclusive. If the ultrasound didn't show anything, that they could do a CT scan. If the CT scan didn't show anything, then they could do a third and final test called a nuclear scan. So I went for the ultrasound, and it came back inconclusive. Then I went for the CT scan, and nothing conclusive again. Then I went for the nuclear scan, and again, nothing. So at this point, the gallbladder has been ruled out as a possibility, but it seemed as though when they found out what the problem wasn't, they kind of lost interest in finding out what it was. Sometime early in December, I had to go to the emergency room in Elkin, and they ran another CT scan and told me that they found a small lesion on my lower bowel. They told me that it didn't look too serious, but they wanted to check it out just to be on the safe side. I was told that they would set up an appointment for an MRI and a biopsy, and they would be in touch to give me the appointment date. I went home. I got home around 12:15 a.m. I went to bed, and I woke up around 4 that morning. I needed to go to the bathroom, and I started to get up and go, but I fell back asleep. At least I thought I did. You ever have those dreams where you're falling and you wake up when you hit the ground? Well, that's what I thought had happened to me. When I first woke up, I didn't open my eyes immediately. I just lay there for a few moments. I realized that my cover was not on me, and I started reaching around looking for it. I couldn't find it. So I thought I must have kicked it off into the floor. When I opened up my eyes finally to search for my covers, I was staring at my kitchen stove. Now at this point, I started to panic because I have no idea how it got into the kitchen. Then as I lay there, it came back to me that I had gotten up to go to the bathroom and must have passed out in the kitchen. Now here's the first example of God's hand at play in my life during this whole situation. I live in a single-wide mobile home, and those things are not exactly known for their space. My kitchen is very cramped with the stove, fridge, and kitchen table kind of clustered together. I have about 6.5 to 7 square feet to move around in. The space that I fell in is marginally smaller. Where my kitchen and living room meet, I have a small display case / table that I keep a family-sized King James Version Bible on display. It has a wood trim with a glass top and sides. When I woke up that morning, my head was about a foot away from the edge of that table. If I had been just a few inches back towards the living room, my head could have caught the edge of that table. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the term blunt force trauma to the head. You probably also know that when that happens, it's not a good outcome for the person that it happens to. Just a few inches back, and I might not be standing here talking to you today. Now, if that doesn't tell you God was looking out for me, I'm not entirely sure what would. I can close my eyes and visualize myself falling, and God's mighty hand reaching down and pushing me forward the few inches that I needed to clear that table. I thank Him often for His mercy that night. His grace is sufficient.
Yes, yes.
So later the next week, I'm informed that my appointment was scheduled for the MRI and biopsy, but it was sometime in late February. I'm thinking, February? That's 2 months away, and I'm sick now. I need answers now. I'm starting to get frustrated here because I'm really starting to feel like nobody's interested in finding out what is wrong with me. I continue on at this point and try to do the best I can. I'm missing a lot of work, and I just seem to be getting worse as the days go by. Luckily, I have a very kind and understanding boss in Miss Stephanie Miles, and she works with me through the process. Thank you, Steph. Let's skip forward to February the 5th. It's a Sunday morning, and I woke up and started getting ready to go to church. It was one of those rare days that I actually felt like doing anything. I noticed a nagging pain in my left bicep and shoulder. It was more annoying than painful, so I didn't pay much attention. Now, most everyone knows what a huge NASCAR fan I am, and that night was the first race of the year. It's an exhibition race called the Clash of the Coliseum. So that night, I'm sitting on the couch watching the race, and the pain in my arm and shoulder is getting worse, and has already started creeping up into my neck. My head has also started to hurt, and I was nauseous. I got sick and threw up, and I decided it would be best if I went to bed. I lay down, but the pain was getting worse. I was getting concerned at this point, and I knew that I needed to do something, but I wasn't sure what to do. I didn't want to call 911 because I wasn't entirely sure that it was that serious. So the more I lay there in pain, the more I realized I had to take some action because it was more serious than I wanted to believe. You know, us humans, we hear about a particular illness happening to someone else, but there's no way that could happen to us. So I got up and called 911. I thought about driving myself to the hospital at first, but I knew the signs of a heart attack and didn't think that it would be wise to be behind the wheel of a car if I was indeed having one. So when the 911 operator answered, I told them that I thought I was having a heart attack. I gave them my address and the ambulance was dispatched. Now again, I must bring up the fact that I live in a single-wide mobile home and the fact that they're not spacious. I was bigger than I am now, and I couldn't imagine them trying to get a gurney in there, much less getting it back out with me on it. So I walked outside and met the ambulance and walked on board. They laid me down and hooked me up to an EKG. A few minutes later, the driver came back and said, "We have to have a serious conversation. You're right in the middle of having a heart attack, and we need to get you to a catheterization unit as soon as possible. And the fastest way to do that is to airlift you. Are you okay with that?" I said, "Yes." Now, when a lot of people have a heart attack, they die instantly. They have no idea on earth what happened to them. Some don't die but aren't able to maintain consciousness. Some remain conscious but are pretty much immobile. For me to be able to get on board that ambulance on my own power is another testament of God's love and mercy. I thank Him for His love. His grace is sufficient. I have said jokingly since I was asked if being airlifted was okay with me, that had I known I would get a bill for almost $29,000 for that whirlybird ride, I would have been a little less hesitant about my answer. Of course, I do realize that surviving a heart attack can be just a matter of minutes. Now, on the way to the hospital, they have given me 3 nitro tablets and some morphine for the pain. They said that the morphine would calm me down, which is a good thing because I'm extremely claustrophobic, and those air care choppers are very closed in. I also don't care much for heights, and being up in the air in that sardine can wasn't something that I would have been too crazy about either. I say it was the morphine that calmed me, but I know that Jesus was riding on that helicopter with me and was holding my hand the whole way. I remember looking out at the lights below us and thinking how pretty they were. The pilot told me that it was a clear night and we should have a pretty smooth ride. He said we might hit some turbulence when we went over the ridges, but other than that, we should be okay. If we did hit any turbulence, I didn't notice it, and we arrived at Baptist smoothly. When we arrived, they took me straight into the catheterization unit immediately. They placed 2 stents in the arteries that was 100% blocked. The initial plan was to place more stents into the other 2 arteries that were blocked the next day. A surgeon came to see me the next day and told me that at my age, they thought that bypass surgery would be the better long-term solution. They said if I was 80 and this was happening to me, that they would recommend the stents, but he felt like the bypass surgery would add more years to my life. They put me on the on Plavix, Eliquis, and aspirin for blood thinning. I spent the next 2 days in Baptist and went home on Wednesday. That Sunday morning, I woke up not feeling too good. I was sick to my stomach and was throwing up all day. I had been drinking red Gatorade all day, trying to keep my electrolytes up, so when I threw up, it was red. I didn't pay much attention to it. Later that night, I was watching the Super Bowl. I was still throwing up, but it had gone from a bright red to a dark, grainy-looking red. I looked it up on WebMD and saw that it was a potential sign of internal bleeding. I called Stephanie and told her what was going on. She immediately came, as she always does in my time of need, and took me to Elkin to the emergency room. I threw up again in the triage, and they saw it was blood. They admitted me that night. They were going to do an endoscopy the next day. When they found out about the heart attack, they said they didn't have a heart doctor on staff that could go into the ER with me in case something happened when I was sedated. They told me that they would arrange to have me transferred to Baptist to have the procedure done. They came after me the next morning and took me back to Baptist. This was on a Tuesday morning. That evening, they took me down to do the procedure. When I came to afterward, one of the technicians told me that they had found a mass in my esophagus that looked cancerous. They had done a biopsy and would let me know the next morning. I won't lie. I was scared at first, and I even cried. I called Stephanie and told her about what I was told. I needed to talk to someone, and per usual, she was there for me. After I hung up the phone, I remembered a verse from the Bible that said, "Be still and know that I am God." It brought instant relief. They came in the next morning and told me that it was indeed cancerous. Now let me tell you about the third time God was looking out for me. It turns out the reason that I was throwing up blood was an overabundance of blood thinners. I was also told that esophageal cancer is very hard to discover. And by most of the time they do find it, it's way too late to do anything about it. Again, a clear display of God's intervention. Let me tell you that God works in mysterious ways is not just something people say. It is evident in our everyday lives if we know where to look. I thank God for His mercy and His love. His grace is sufficient. A couple of weeks later, I started my radiation treatments, and they weren't so bad at first. I was told they would get pretty bad as time went on, and boy, did they ever. My first chemo treatment was a totally different story. After about 10 minutes in, I started to get very sick, and they had to stop. They gave me some medicine for nausea and some steroids and let me rest for about 15 minutes. By the time we got started back, the nausea medicine had kicked in, and I slept through the rest of it. I thank God for His mercy and love. His grace is sufficient. The radiation, as I said, did get worse over time, and I developed a heartburn that just wouldn't go away. And when it did calm down, all it took was one bite of food to make it come back. I got to where I couldn't eat and wound up back in the hospital for a week. They put a feeding tube in my throat, but they had to take it back out because it was choking me too bad. They discussed putting one in my stomach, but I was determined to not let that happen. So I started to force myself to eat. That was in May, and since I got back home and have been eating better, I have improved vastly. I just want to say thank you to Paige Poe for taking me back and forth for my treatments. We bonded during those trips, and she is forever my little sister. I've lost a lot of things during this ordeal. I lost my appetite, I lost weight, I lost my balance, I lost consciousness. One thing I can truly say that I did not lose was my faith. I am a living, breathing testimony to God's love, mercy, and goodness. His grace is sufficient.
Yes, it is.
I don't know what the road ahead of me holds, but I know who holds the road ahead of me.
Amen.
I still have the surgery to remove the cancer and the bypass surgery ahead of me, but I will fear not. Now, I've been very blessed to be surrounded by very loving, giving, caring, generous people in my life. And I believe God sees our futures. He knows what's going to happen in our lives. And He puts people in our lives because He knows that's what we need. And I just want to thank everybody that's done anything for me. I've not been able to work since February, but my bills have been paid every month. And that's the power of the Lord right there. Jesus said, if he be for me, then who be against me? Whatever happens from this point, Father, let your will be done. I know that whether you heal me physically or eternally, I